collection, and the data-related technical assistance that PRB provides to the network that you all love so much. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it along to Alicia. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Flo. Good afternoon, everyone. Just before I start, to say please forgive my voice and any coughing. I am recovering from a mild cold. So as Flo said, today I'm going to share with you just some best practices and some of the tools that we use at PRB to help us manage all of our data. As you're all aware, the amount of data that is available today can be rather overwhelming. And a lot of the new media that you all are using, such as blogs, webinars, and social media, they've all broadened where data-related content is published and increased the pace of publication. And so this has created a huge challenge for Kids Count organizations because you need to sort through all the data to know what's available, when it will be available, and how to process these disparate types of data. And you need to do this all while aiming to produce timely and accurate estimates, possibly under new time crunches. So effective data management can help your organization be responsive and efficient in this new data environment. Data management can also help with what many directors or supervisors refer to as the hit by a bus scenario. What would you do if what would your organization do if the data analyst just happened to float away one day? Would somebody else be able to step in and immediately pick up the data-related work? Data management, having a good data management plan will help your organization build and maintain knowledge continuity. So over the course of today's webinar, I'm going to briefly describe what data management is and build a case for why having a good data management plan is important. Then I'll spend the bulk of the presentation outlining some of the best practices and tools for developing a data management plan that will be effective and efficient and easy for you all to implement. I'd really like you to walk away with some tips and tricks that help you feel empowered about managing all of your data. I do want to point out that at PRB we are data analysts, and so I'm going to be describing some of our best practices, but there are lots of different ways that, and different tools available for data management. Here at PRB we primarily use low-tech options, but I will highlight a few newer technologies that you might want to look into. All right, so what is data management? As you all know, Kids Count organizations receive and use data from lots of different data providers. So the properties of these data vary considerably across the different sources. You have to deal with new data becoming available at different times. You have to deal with data referring to different time periods. Some might be survey data, some might be administrative data, and so on. You're then tasked with taking these disparate data and transforming them into data products that are published or updated throughout the year. So in this context, data management is a set of procedures and policies aimed at keeping your data-related work, and the data products you create organized, accessible, and secure. The goal is to really help you organize the chaos. So more formally, data management is a process that occurs simultaneously with the work you're accomplishing. So data management, it outlines how data are stored and protected. It describes and documents where data come from, how data were transformed, and how data were used in a data product. Data management also includes the steps taken for quality control and quality assurance. So why is data management important, and what can you gain by managing your data more effectively? So one of the core components of Kids Count is to provide reliable data, the reliable data that is needed to inspire action for improving child well-being. By having effective data management practices, you can help ensure that you are releasing the highest quality and valid data. And you'll know that you're releasing high quality data because you have clear quality assurance procedures and documentation outlining your work. Data management can also help you save time and be more efficient because you'll be more organized. You'll be able to bring up new staff members up to speed more quickly, and you can reduce some duplicate work. Data management practices will also help you lower the risk of data loss by specifying appropriate data storage procedures. And across all these benefits, it will mean that you'll be able to make your data more accessible and increase its impact. And finally, I'm not sure if any of you are in this position, but some funders do require that you have a data management plan for any data that you use. So now I'm going to move on to describing how to implement different aspects of data management. And I'm going to start with storing and securing data. Well, storing and securing data is a very big part of data management. So you'll need to make decisions about where you store data and how you're going to access it for any data processing or data transformations. You also need to decide how to keep track of all of those changes that you make to data or data processing files and your final data products. You'll want to do this through a version control system. You'll also need to have systems in place to back up your data so you won't experience any data loss. And if you're working with any confidential data, you need mechanisms to help keep your data secure. The exact method that you use for data storage and preservation will likely depend on the IT systems and rules and regulations in place at your organization, but some of the best practices can be followed in any system. So I'm going to just briefly talk about 3 different types of or tools that you can use to store data, and those are on a hard drive, on network servers, or in the cloud. So each of these methods, they all have pros and cons, and which method makes sense at a given time. It could possibly vary across data sources and data products, so I think it's important to know what works well when and kind of make decisions based on your needs. So storing data on a hard drive, that's probably the easiest way. It's probably the way that what you're all the most familiar with. But storing data on a single hard drive makes it really hard to share your files with other people. You always have to email files or use things like thumb drives. You also need to develop some type of backup system to make sure your data are always preserved because your data are just on this one hard drive, and if that fails, your data would be gone. Another option is to use network servers. This is probably also something most of you are familiar with. These operate very much like a hard drive, but everything is networked. So the big advantage here is that it's very easy to share data within an organization. Anyone logged into the network that has access to shared files and folders can work on data. The system does obviously require more IT knowledge and power, and there still needs to be a dedicated method for backing up and preserving all of the data within the organization. The newest method, which is something you're also probably familiar with, is storing data in the cloud. So these are services like Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, or Binder. The big advantage of using storing data in the cloud is that your data are always backed up automatically without you even thinking about it. These services are also set up to make sharing files very easy, especially files that are too big for email. The downside of the cloud is that it's not always clear who owns the data, and you're relying on an outside organization to keep your data safe and secure. So you really have to pay attention to the policy, the use and privacy policies for each of the services. In general, Box and Binder are geared toward businesses, and they have much clearer policies about ownership and privacy. And they also, excuse me, they also have many more options to control access to shared folders. Dropbox and Google Drive are more geared toward consumers, and they may have a little bit less flexibility. Excuse me. So Once you've decided where to store your data, I then recommend developing a folder and file organization system that you use consistently for all of your data sources and data-related work. By having a very systematic folder organization, that will save you time and mental energy because you'll just always know where to look for a particular type of file, even if the data source varies. Having an organization system also makes it easier to replicate what you've done before, which could help you avoid redoing work and possibly reduce year-to-year errors. It's also really easy for a new staff member to kind of pick up and see how the project is organized if all of the folders and files are organized in the same way. So another best practice for organizing data files is to always keep the original or raw data file that you receive from a data provider in their own central location. And you want to keep this original data file separate from any work or analysis that you'll be doing with the data. You should also always keep all of the documentation and metadata that describes how the data were created and how to use them with the original data. Then when you are conducting any calculations or doing any analytic work with the data, you want to make a working copy of the data to analyze in Excel, or you'll want to use a temporary data set within a statistical software program. And you'll keep all of this data-related work in an area separate from the original data. So keeping the original data and your data-related work in separate spaces is really important because you want to you always want to be able to replicate your analyses and all of your data collection efforts start to finish. By keeping your original data file in a separate location, it means that there's a much smaller chance of you accidentally overwriting or changing the original data in a way that would mean you couldn't replicate your work. Oftentimes, you also are using the same data source for multiple indicators, or you have multiple people working with the same data source. By having the original data stored in its own location, makes it easier for everyone else who might be using that data source to grab it from that central spot rather than there being lots of original copies of the data floating around. All right, so what does this type of data storage and file organization system look like in practice? So on this slide, I've mapped out one possible way you could organize your work. So in this example, you're creating 4 different indicators for poverty that you want to publish on the Kids Count Data Center. You're working on an indicator for population in poverty, children in poverty by age, and persons 18 to 24 in poverty. You know that you'll be using data from the American Community Survey and that all the data for these 4 indicators is stored in a single table on American Fact Finder. So the way I have this set up, you begin by downloading and saving the data table from American Fact Finder into a central repository. Here, that's what I've labeled as AFF tables. And then you would create separate folders for each of the indicators, and you'd send a working copy of the data table to each folder. And then within each indicator folder, you would keep all of your work. So you'd keep all of the calculations and analyses, any of the documentation about what you did, as well as the final data product that you post on the data center. So, and as you can see in this example, there's a very clear pattern of organization that is the same across all indicators. You could then repeat the same type of organization for all of your indicators and do the same for all of your data sources. So, and this is just one possible way of organizing this work. You can come up with a different method if it works better for you. The point is really just being really methodical and thinking through how to store things. And then being consistent across all of your sources. So another key component for data and file organization is version control. So as you all know, data work is frequently iterative, And version control is a process that allows you to have a history of improvements and changes to your data that are easy to follow. You'll be able, with a good version control system, you'll know when changes were made, where they were made, and by having this good history, you'll be able to hopefully do less rework, and hopefully you'll also be able to identify errors more quickly. Version control is also very helpful because it prevents you from unintentionally sending the wrong file to somebody, or prevents you from working on the wrong file. And if you're ever in a case where a file is lost or corrupted, you can always roll back to a previous version and recover all of that information. So there are a couple different ways to do version control. You can do it manually, you can do it in the cloud, or you can use a dedicated version control software. So manual version control involves copying a file and then saving it with a new name. So for manual version control to be effective, you will need to develop a very clear set of naming conventions that are always used. So you can include things like version number, the initials of the person who modified the data, the date that it was modified, as well as the status. So as you can see in this example that I have in the lower right-hand side of your screens, in this example we use dates and the initials of people who modified the document. You can also create separate folders for drafts, revisions, and send files. That's another way to help keep your documents separated. As you saw with the list of things you could possibly include in the naming conventions for version control, if you are doing manual version control, it can be really helpful to create a version log. And in this version log, you can keep track of key information so you always know which is the right version you should be looking at. So in this example, I have shown a version log that Jean and I could have used for keeping track of the different versions of our data that we used as we worked on the 2017 Kids Count data book. So you can see here that I have listed the name of the document that we each worked on. I then listed who modified that document last. I made a list of the different modifications that were made in each file as we progressed through our work. I added a note about what date these modifications made, and then a status of where the file is. So manual version control can be really useful because it's generally a familiar system, and it's really easy to implement on any platform. And other than developing a consistent set of naming conventions, there's really little learning curve to using the system. It's also helpful because if you store all of your versions in the same folder, you can just open up the folder and see your progression. And finally, it is free. But manual version control can be problematic. When you have a lot of versions, it can be cumbersome to keep everything organized. You also have to make sure that everybody who could be using these files and data, that everybody is consistent with their naming conventions and that everyone is following the same rules. And if there's any chance that there could be confusion as to which version is what, you need to make sure you have really good records, like the version log that I just showed you. But creating those types of records can be time consuming. And I'm sure many of you have been in the same situation as me, where you open up a file, you start working on it, you hit save instead of save as, and you accidentally overwrite a file rather than creating a new version. So it's really easy when you're doing this manual system to accidentally overwrite something. So sometimes you want to have something that's a little bit more automated. So that's what these next two options are. So if you're doing version control in the cloud, this really goes hand in hand with if you're storing your files in the cloud. The way version control in the cloud works is that there's only one version of every file. that's stored in the cloud. You make changes to your file, and the software, the platform where your data is stored, that automatically creates a version history for you. The different software, they typically keep track of who made changes and when the changes were made. And a good thing with these, with working in the cloud, is that even though you only have one file, if that file becomes, if like your most recent version becomes corrupt or you made changes you didn't want to keep, it's usually really easy to roll back to an earlier version. So I'm not going to go into details as to how version control works on all these different platforms. Just know that there are some differences. So one of the benefits of using the cloud, as I said, is that version control is automatic. You don't even have to think about it. It just happens behind the scenes. So it's also relatively simple because you only have one copy of each file. You just have the most recent copy. And collaborative work is really easy because anyone can just go into a shared folder and get their hands on the latest version. You don't have to keep emailing different versions to people. And it is really quite easy to roll back to an earlier version of a document. But the automatic nature of using the cloud also means that you have the least amount of control. Versions are created and saved according to the service's algorithms. So there's also no record of what changes were made across the different versions. Like all they keep track of is who made a change and when it was made. So you have to then do your own record keeping to know kind of the history of different changes that were made across versions. Everyone on the team also has to be using the same cloud service, and you still will need to have sequential editing across people. If you have multiple people accessing that latest copy on the cloud and editing at the same time, you'll end up with a document that conflicts, and you have to choose what document to keep. And finally, many of the cloud services are not free, especially if you want to use all the version control features. For example, I know with Dropbox, I think you can keep all of your versions that are created for 30 days, but anything longer than that you have to pay for. So that could be a bit problematic. So a final way to do version control is to use a web hosting service that's specifically designed for version control. So GitHub and Bitbucket are two examples of these types of software. These specialty softwares are similar to using the cloud in that all of your files are stored in a central repository in the cloud, but here the user is actually directing the version control process. So if, say, somebody working at Workstation 1 wants to make changes to a file, what they do is they pull that file from the central repository onto their local computer. They then can make all of their changes and do everything that they want. And when they're done and they think they have a new version, they then push it back up to the central repository. And when that file is pushed back, the central repository logs a new version, which then replaces that older version. And then you have your new file. So as of the cloud, you can always go into the central repository and you can roll back to an earlier version if you need to. These services, they are geared toward software developers, so they're most useful for text files such as statistical program code, but there are ways to use these services for other types of files. So the main benefit of using a dedicated version control software is that it gives you the most control while also simplifying the number of versions that are visible within a single folder. So one of the really big benefits of the specialty software is also that when a new version is created, the software is actually able to see and track the changes that have been made, so you end up with a detailed record of what changed across versions. And so because the software can also track changes, certain types of files, especially program code, can be edited simultaneously and all changes will be reconciled in the central repository. A downside of these services is that they have a steep learning curve, and they definitely are suited to work best with program code. You can use them with Word and Excel, but the features and functionality is much more limited. And as with the cloud, if you're working on a team, everyone has to use the same platform. And also storing data in these services is not always free or private. So for example, everything on GitHub is public unless you pay for a private account. Bitbucket is private, meaning that no one can see your data or your work. But if you have a large team, I think it's if you have more than 5 people that need to work on access the Bitbucket files, or if you need a lot of storage, you do have to pay for the service. So as you can see, there are lots of different ways to store and organize your data, lots of different ways to do version control. I think you just need to kind of think about your overall workflow and think about the exact method that would be most appropriate for that workflow and the different types of data that you'll be working with, and just use that kind of information to help you develop a system that works for you and then be consistent in using it. So I'm now going to move on to talk about documenting your data and your work. So as you all know, working on Kids Count data collection means that you are working with many, many different data sources. You have data that's coming from the American Community Survey that's released every single year on a set schedule. You know that you can plan for it. But you're also working with data that might be released every few years or on an inconsistent schedule. You have some data that you might need to actually contact a data provider about and specifically request that data. And you have other data that's publicly available. So there's lots of different moving pieces, and you need to develop a way to track all those data sources and know what's available and when it's available. So here at PRB, what we do to help us track all of our data sources is to create a tracking database. We do this in a simple spreadsheet tool such as Excel. I find that using a spreadsheet is quite easy and flexible. I can add columns and rows of information as needed and really tailor it to my own needs. You can also use filters to look at specific pieces of information in the database to help you really focus in on whatever data source it is that you're trying to work with. So here is a snapshot of the tracking database that I use for the National Kids Count data collection that we do on the data center. And I do make a new version of this database excuse me, every single year. And I do it that way to help me keep track of year-to-year changes in data collection. So I have this file organized so that I can I'm just trying to get my arrow to work. There we go. I have this organized so that I can see every single indicator that is on the data center. And then I have listed the data source that I use or that we use to collect that data. I also have the year that we are going to be working on, so whatever year the data refers to. I have the estimated date of when data will become available. And I also keep track of the date that I post or that we post data up on the data center. And then have a small section for key notes. Here I just keep really limited things about if the data was delayed and when we think it might come out, or like in the example with the National Survey of Drug Use, that there was a questionnaire change in 2015, so we couldn't update data this year. I then have a column where I just say how I access the data. So can I download it from the data source directly? Is it in a published report, or do I have to submit a request? And then finally, I actually include a link to the data. So if I know, population estimates were released and we need to go in and download them, someone can just open up this tracking database and go click on this link, and it will take them right to the data source. They don't have to try to remember how to navigate through the Census Bureau's website to find that data. So you don't have to include all of this information in a tracking database. You can also add in other information that you might find helpful, such as like who worked on an indicator, or when the data were actually released. The trick I've found with working with these tracking databases is to really develop something that contains the minimum amount of information you need to keep track of all of your data sources. I found that if there's unnecessary information in the database, that the amount of data that you're looking at in the spreadsheet just becomes overwhelming, and it's harder to find the information that you're looking for, and that you might end up being less likely to use it. So in this example, like what I find really helpful is sometimes I'll sort or filter this database by date, so I can see kind of what data is coming up and what data is about to be released, so I can plan out any data collection efforts that we have. So in addition to tracking data sources, you will need a way to stay on top of data releases. That tracking database is really helpful for things with a set schedule, but there are other things where there will be changes in schedules or other data that doesn't have a release schedule. So what I like to do is, sorry, I'm going to back up just a second and say what I do with the tracking database in my own work calendar. I try to take all of my anticipated release dates that I have in that tracking database, and I import them all into my calendar so that I know when I should contact a data provider about new data or when I should look for data to be released. I find that just to be really helpful, so I don't have to really go back to that tracking database too often once I have everything in my calendar. So then you have the rest of the data sources that don't have a set release schedule, or they have a release schedule that might change. And so for this, I recommend trying to automate as much of the data release information as you possibly can. So many data providers, they have a listserv or a newsletter or a Twitter account that you can follow. You can also try to build a custom Google alert to let you know when something about a data source has been posted on the internet. So this way you're actually alerted when the data are released rather than having to go look for it yourself. And lastly, I'd also recommend continuing to build relationships with all of your data providers. And this way you can ask them questions and share how you're using the data with them, but they can also then let you know when data are released or when they think data might be released. So the next part of documentation is to document all of your data-related work. By having a clear set of documenting your work, it makes data much easier to be checked and replicated. It makes it easier for newer members of your staff to continue on with any of the data collection efforts. Documenting your work can be done in many different ways. So you can use that tracking database that I just showed you to document some high-level changes about your work, as well as the status of different data collection efforts. Other ways to document your work is to create a README file for every single data source or for every single indicator. You can also add notes into statistical software programs or into Excel. You'd also want to make sure you always have source notes on any data that you publish. And another thing that you would want to do is maintain a research log. So a README file generally contains highly readable notes about the data work that was done for a particular indicator. So in this case, I'm showing an example of the indicator low birth weight babies. So you generally want a README file to contain information about where the data came from. So here the source is Vital Statistics, and it was acquired through CDC Wonder. And you want to include information about the populations that you're using for the indicator. So here we have that the numerator are all babies of low birth weight, and that the denominator is all babies with a known birth weight. And then you want to include any other key information about the indicator. So here it's that data are suppressed when there are fewer than 20 cases. And then you can also, if this is an indicator that's getting updated every single year, you can include notes that are specific to that year. So for example, in 2014, data for the Virgin Islands wasn't available. So having a README file set up like this for every indicator, it gives you a running history of any problems or challenges you've had with indicators over the years. So including notes in a statistical program is very similar to a README file. So you'd want to kind of include some of the same information, but you'd be keeping that information in the notes section of the program. When I'm working in statistical programs, we also like to keep some additional information such as the purpose of the program, what the program does, just kind of more descriptive notes for anybody to open it up rather than having them have to read all of the program code. Especially helpful to have variable definitions. So in this example, I'm not sure how clear this image is, but I have the actual variable names that are used in the analysis and what those variables are measuring. And then throughout the whole program, you'll want to include notes about what's happening at each stage. So like what's being calculated or something's being sorted, and information like that. And you'll want to write your notes within programs at a level for somebody who has very limited familiarity with the program or with the indicator. Like these types of notes are very, very helpful for newer staff members. So you really want them to be written at a very basic level and to be very, very clear. So then you also probably work a lot in Excel. And so for data-related work you do in Excel, you also really want to keep really good notes about what you're doing at every stage. So here, kind of as with the README file and with the statistical software program example, I started off by listing what indicators being worked on, where the data came from, and the year that's going on. I then, at the top of all of the columns, I provided a note about what's happening in these different cells. So for this first set of columns, it's just a copy of the original data that was downloaded from CDC Wonder. I then have my columns where the calculation is actually done, and I actually put a note for what the formulas were used for those calculations, so that you can just easily see what was done. And then have my columns for formatting for the data center, and then I just have a copy with no formulas, which is what we actually end up posting on the data center. So the last piece of documenting your work that I want to talk about is maintaining a research log. A research log is a very useful way of preserving the history of a project. I like to refer to my research logs as my project brain. It's kind of where I hold all the information about major decisions or changes that have been made over the course of a data-related project. So it's really important to document the methods that you've selected or the indicators you've selected, any data sources changes, and really document why you made certain decisions. So you can always go back, like if you're in the middle of trying to do some type of data collection and you're like, I know we made some decision about X, but you couldn't remember Y, you can always go back to your research log and be able to look up why you made a certain decision. Also, the inevitable will probably happen, and there will be errors at times in your data-related work. And it's important to keep track of your errors so that they can either be prevented in the future or that you know how they were handled. So you might find errors in data you receive from a data provider, or you might find errors in what you released. And you should keep track of how you corrected that error. There are many different tools that you can use to maintain a research log. What tool you use, I think it depends on how you like to track things and kind of what type of information you want to maintain. My personal preference is to use OneNote. I really like OneNote because you can set it up in a way that it's really easy to organize information across time and across different data sources. You can tag files and tag information, so it's really easy to search through a giant OneNote file. And you can also really easily attach different files for documentation, so you can attach emails or reports that might support any of the decisions that you made. And it's just really nice to have all of that information stored in one spot. So the final thing I'm going to talk about today is quality assurance. And although it probably is obvious to all of you, but ensuring that your data are correct is extremely important. An organization can spend years trying to build a reputation as a credible source of data, and if you make just one high-profile mistake, you could damage that reputation. So you want to be sure that you have a very clear way of conducting extensive fact-checking on all of your numbers, tables, and charts before you provide them to the public. So having standardized quality assurance procedures can make this fact-checking process much more efficient and much more complete. So there are several different procedures that will be used, and I'm just going to very briefly cover some of them. And the methods that you select, they will change depending on where your data came from and how you compiled your data. So before I get into the specific steps that you could use for quality control, I just want to go over a couple best practices that can really help improve the quality of your data. So one practice is to use double data collection. So this is where two different people independently collect the same data and then compare their results. So for example, when PRB calculates the index for the Kids Count data book, two of us go through all of the steps of compiling the data and creating the index. And we do this without discussing our process with each other along the way. That way they're really and truly just two independent efforts. At the end, we compare our final results. And if, for example, our index rankings don't match, we then work together to resolve any inconsistencies. A second option, somewhat similar to that, is to also have two people working on the project, but to have one person compile all of the data and then another person to check all of the analytic work and final numbers. So these two practices are really useful because two brains are always better than one. Two people are likely to go about thinking about the data and processing it in different ways, so they're much more likely to catch any errors. So the third best practice is, if you can, is to routinize as much of your work as possible in statistical software programs, such as SAS. Manually manipulating data in Excel can lead to lots of mistakes due to sorting, copying, and pasting errors. Statistical software creates a history of how you manipulated your data so that it can be really used for processing your data. But statistical software program can also be used to help you suppress anything, and it can be used to label your data. And you can even use the statistical software to create your final tables and final table layouts. So it can be a big time saver once you set up those programs. So obviously, these three practices, they are time consuming and they require a lot of staff time. Statistical software program is not free, so it might not be feasible to follow some of these best practices due to budget or staffing limitations, but they are something to consider. And even if you are using any of these three best practices, you'll still need to develop and implement systematic QA procedures. So quality assurance, it needs to happen at every single stage of data collection, from reviewing the data received from a data provider all the way to fact-checking the final product. So the first step is that you'd always want to review all of your documentation that comes with a data source. This will help you familiarize yourself with how the data were created. So you'll learn about how the methods that created the data, the questionnaire, any variable coding, and understanding how this data was created. It will help you make decisions about the methods to use and any indicators that you'd like to use for your analytic work. Reviewing the documentation is also necessary when you're updating indicators every year with newly released data. Many times there are year-to-year changes in your data sources. And you have to pay attention to these types of changes because you could accidentally show a trend when there actually should be a break in trend because variables changed in such a way, or your methods might have changed in a way that really hinders the ability to compare, to have two comparable data points across time. So the next thing you'd want to do, especially when you're updating indicators for an annually newly released data is that you'll want to review the data processing documentation from the prior year's analysis. So just doing a simple review of the README files, of the data processing steps, and the research log, they'll help alert you to anything that was unusual about the prior year that may have implications for your data collection in this current year. Doing this kind of review can also help you catch any mistakes in data processing that might impact the quality of your data. And then finally, you'll need to fact check your final estimates or numbers. So there's lots of different ways that you can fact check, and the best option does depend on the type of data you're working with. So if you're working with statistical software, you'll want to review the log files and make sure there are no errors or warning messages, and that the number of observations are as expected. You can also print out a subset of cases and check to make sure that the code is producing the intended results. You can also use triangulation, and this is a technique that validates your data by verifying it against other sources. So one example is to compare your estimates to any published data. Another good thing to do for yearly updates is to compare your current year data to any of the trend data to make sure that any year-to-year change is within reason. So for example, if you see a 50 percentage point increase in an indicator, that might raise some red flags that something could be wrong. If you have data that's been disaggregated into smaller geographic areas or smaller categories, you want to make sure that you can sum up all the parts and that you get the same total result. So for example, if you're disaggregating data at the county level, you want to make sure if you sum up all that county level data that you will get the same statewide estimate. Another thing you can do is if you're working with lots of data, so again, if you're working with data at the county level, you can sort all the results either by name or by the size of your results, so say like the proportion of kids in poverty, and then kind of scan over all of the data just to kind of see if there are outliers. You can use this to see if there are counties that are missing or other potential problems. You can also ask a colleague who knows the subject material. And then lastly, you should always preview data on an internal server before you're publishing it to a live site. So for example, after uploading data to the Kids Count Data Center, you should review the data in preview mode before you publish it. And this will help you check for formatting or any other oddities that might have happened in the uploading process. So, and just to wrap up, I do want to point you toward a few new resources that have been added to the Advocacy Learning Lab that can help you with data management. So as I kind of discussed over today's webinar, data management is it's a multifaceted process, and it needs to occur at every step of data-related work, and there's a lot of moving parts to it. So these three resources that are available on the Advocacy Learning Lab, they cover some of what I discussed today, but they also provide a lot more information about recoding data, building relationships with data providers, and how to leverage your data to inspire action. So with that, I will open it up for any questions.
Great, thank you, Alicia. If any of you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the question box that is on the left-hand side of your screen. I just wanted to thank Alicia. I think a lot of what the materials that you provided are key, especially since there's often lots of turnover in the data position, and there might be transition for those people who are doing the data work. So it's really key to record how you all are doing the data collection. And Amy Swan from Kentucky mentioned that she really recommends following PRB's practice of specifying what date the data was updated on the data center in the footnote section, since this might help protect your credibility if a data source revises some of the data without telling anybody after you have posted the information online. So that's something that she recommends. And Robin Miller asked for the URLs for the Advocacy Learning Lab. I'll send you the URL for the all, as well as links to the 3 documents that Alicia just mentioned. They're documents that PRB just recently produced, and I think you'll all find them to be extremely useful. Alicia, I had a question. You mentioned OneNotes and you provided some examples. I was wondering if PRB had any templates that you all use that you might be able to make available to the network, or maybe screenshots of your folders, what they look like and how they're ordered, or anything that you all could provide to help the network with their data management. I don't know if you have any of that, but I thought I would ask.
I don't have any of that prepared right now, but I can certainly go ask my colleagues back at PRB if they can provide some screenshots. I know for something like with OneNote, what I do in OneNote is probably very different than what other people do, so there's a lot of variation with that. The screenshot for the tracking data source, that tracking database that's in this presentation, is the one that I use. My colleague Beth, she uses a different one for some of the work she manages. And there's a snapshot of, I think, of her tracking database in the data sources document that's on the Advocacy Learning Lab. But I can see if I can get some other screenshots of how we organize things.
Great. Yeah, I think it would be useful to include along with today's presentation.
Okay.
But great. So I don't see any other questions. If nobody has any burning questions right now, we'll say goodbye to you guys. If you have anything that comes up as you're thinking about your plan or managing your data, please feel free to reach out to us or PRB. Thank you all for your time. Hopefully you found the webinar useful. Thank you. Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you, Flo.